I always love to hear someone introduce me because every time it's introduced slightly differently. Um, so I was asked to come in and talk about sovereign AI. So I'm the token AI guy in the room. Every conference now has to have a token AI guy that comes and talks about artificial intelligence. But actually, sovereign AI, look, we've been talking about sovereign cloud today, and the Team Cloud and the Oracle guys have done a very good job about explaining what the infrastructure as a service is and the software as a service and running sovereign cloud. So sovereign AI is functionally greater than what that looks like. So when we talk about sovereign AI, we're not just talking about where it runs. By the way, we are talking about where it runs. The artificial intelligence, to be sovereign, needs to run in some place that's considered sovereign. But we also need to take into account the data that was used to train that artificial intelligence. So 5 million people in New Zealand. If you're using a foundational model from Meta or OpenAI, you're not even a rounding error of the data that was used to train that foundational model. So even if you picked up one of Meta's models and ran it in an Oracle cloud here in New Zealand, it's not sovereign AI. Now, what does that mean for your customers? It means that the AI doesn't necessarily bend towards New Zealand. It doesn't necessarily understand New Zealand accents. Now, I know that my accent doesn't sound very, very New Zealand. I've been here 11 years. I'm a citizen. I'm allowed to say that. But the reality is that most of the natural language processing that isn't developed in New Zealand doesn't take into account New Zealand accents, let alone Maori words. And by the way, my son, my 4-year-old, corrects my Maori pronunciation on literally a daily basis. So sovereign AI is more than just where it runs. It's the data that was used to train it, and it's how the data that the AI collects is used. So the second thing is that once you have a model trained on New Zealand data, assuming we have enough data to actually train the model, that model's going to actually do something with the data that it collects. If all that data comes in and immediately goes overseas and is used by, I don't know, a large social media company to create an echo chamber for people in New Zealand to only hear news about New Zealand, then that fundamentally is not sovereign AI. Now, for government agencies, sovereign AI makes a lot of sense. Did everybody at least read the news article, Judith's interview, where she talked about New Zealand needs to build a large language model? By the way, I fundamentally agree with her. There are some reasons within New Zealand, especially on the government side, that we need to be able to do this. But unless you're a government agency, unless you're dealing with iwi data where they're concerned about the sovereignty of their data because it's part of their mana, you might not care, but you should. There is such a thing as company sovereign data. So you as a company, I'm going to ask you a question. How many of you are currently doing AI in your companies today? Just a show of hands. Just, are you doing any AI at all? I hate to tell you this, but those of you not raising your hands, you're probably doing AI and don't know it. Shadow AI is the fastest growing artificial intelligence use case in business today. If you ever use Google to search something online, if your PA ever uses ChatGPT to format your next speech that you have to make at a board meeting, you're using somebody else's AI and somebody else's data and somebody else's business context to be able to deliver you the outcome that you're trying to get for your business. So there is a microcosm, a micro-sovereign for your use of AI. And so some of that might be, I need to run it locally. I have a customer that requires me to maintain that data in New Zealand for a reason. And there are legitimate reasons, whether it be a government agency, whether it be iwi, whether it be goodwill of the... We in New Zealand are very transparent business-wise and government-wise compared to the rest of the world. And so you may be asked by your customers, are you keeping my data in New Zealand before you use it? So there is a need for sovereign AI within your business as well. But you need to understand that there are foundational models, and if you deploy those foundational models and use them in New Zealand and don't take into account the data that was used to train them. Anybody here ever heard of a transcription service called Dragon? Dragon's been around a while. Yeah, Dragon's been around transcribing for a while. By the way, in the early 2000s, Dragon purchased a natural language processing company, and they updated their software, and at that time, they were about 95% accurate in transcription of American English. When we run it against current Dragon services that are cloud-based, SaaS-based, we're looking at about 82% accuracy on New Zealand accents. That's what you get when you're not running Sovereign. Sovereign AI takes into account the data, the training data for the artificial intelligence, but also what's used for that data going forward. And by the way, we're a test bed. I love the fact that you mentioned Saudi Arabia and UAE. The reality is these other countries are actually looking to New Zealand to see how we do sovereign AI because they're going to have to do sovereign AI as well. EU is going to have its own sovereign AI because their legislative laws are going to drive them to have a separate AI just for EU. Who was it? I just saw a news article. It was either Google or OpenAI that said they weren't going to be deploying certain AI services in EU because they couldn't meet the legislative requirements for transparency and data. So understand, this is not a New Zealand problem. This is a New Zealand opportunity. So building sovereign AI in New Zealand can show the rest of the world how they can build sovereign AI, which is, it's running it in a sovereign cloud so that the data stays here in New Zealand, but it's also running it in a way that is sustainable for New Zealand, that uses New Zealand context and New Zealand data to get New Zealand outcomes. I think we've got a few minutes for questions. Yep.
We do have time for questions. Okay. Yes.
Any questions about sovereign AI or artificial intelligence in general?
Yeah, perfect.
Another one of these edge cases, I guess. The GDPR covers European citizens.
Yes, it does.
I'm a European citizen. I live in New Zealand.
Yep.
How is that dealt with in this context?
It's a very good question. Mike? Look, GDPR is a very good question, and as of yet, I'm not aware of a case that that GDPR has been used as for New Zealand citizens. The most visceral one is, you have to forget me because I've asked you to forget everything about me. And I don't know that that's been tested outside of European boundaries. Do you know if it's been tested? I don't think it has. I don't think it's been tested. But the reality is, and by the way, the EU AI Act that just recently passed had in it this transparency around forgetting data. By the way, nobody's proven how to make that work. How do you take an existing foundational model and somehow track it back, remove all the data for that one individual, and then track it forward? And is that even fiscally possible? That hasn't been tested yet. So it's a good question. I don't think we know the answer to it yet.
Does it kind of test whether what you're stating is true or not?
That's right. That's right. So if the answer is we can't, then that might be then you're not sovereign.
Awesome. Any more questions? Ah, Kieran. The photographer's got a question. Love it.
Thank you. I'm curious about the actual data that would form part of a sovereign data set of sorts. Obviously, there's an enormous amount of data that would be required to make a sovereign AI.
It depends.
Okay, it depends. I'm curious about where that data comes from, what that data is, and perhaps the different varieties of data that would make different varieties of AI, whether it's generative or otherwise.
Yeah. So, look, if anybody ever wants to have a deep dive discussion with me about artificial intelligence, I'm more than willing to have that conversation. I have an opinion about generative AI. I think it's the cream on the top of the coffee, and the artificial intelligence is the rest of the coffee. So let's set generative AI aside for a second. Most of the sovereign AI models are going to be smaller level models. The reality is that within 3 years, every single one of you is going to have your own AI agent running on your phone. And it's going to be trained on data that you fed it about you. That's a much smaller model. Now, it'll be based on a foundational model that came out of somewhere. But that's the direction we're going. For businesses, if you have a unique business use case, your business, that uniqueness about your business, generates data, and that data is going to be used to transform with machine learning and AI how you do what you do. And it might tell you what your next product or service you need to build is. Does that answer your question?
Great.
Yeah, I guess there's, I would consider my contributions or my business contributions to a data set kind of an inevitability. But as we speak about, there's a baseline data set and we sort of speak to that. I guess what I'm curious about is what fundamental data should be expected to form that sovereign baseline data set?
Oh, it depends on the use case, right? I mean, the reality is that it could be everything from tabular financial data all the way to just raw recordings of everything that you've said. So I obviously have a horrible American accent. My model's going to have to be trained to be able to understand and by the way, my Alexa at home does. It understands me, and it doesn't understand Kiwis that come over and visit. But they keep wanting on video calls. They keep trying to talk to my Alexa. Yes.
Got another question?
Another question, I guess, is about the boundary of what data constitutes sovereign data. I have relatives all over the world. Is the phone number of my sister who lives in London, who is a British citizen, because it's on my phone, is that sovereign NZ data or is that sovereign UK data?
It's a very good question, and I've had this discussion with several iwi and defining this. So at the very lowest level, even the metadata about your data is considered sovereign to some people depending on how they define it. It's something that we're going to have to work our way through over the next 2 to 3 years. Yeah. It's not an easy answer.
Any more questions?
Look, I want to thank Team Cloud for letting me come in and talk about sovereign AI. This is a space that is going to become hugely important, and especially if you're a government ministry, it's going to be hugely important. But also if you're a business working in New Zealand, you're going to be asked this question more and more because the context of how you use artificial intelligence for your customers is going to matter. Because if your answer is, oh yeah, well, we're using the AI that's built out of North America, that may not resonate very well with your customers. So, thank you very much.